Greetings, everyone. Welcome once again to Bhagavad-gita Satsang. I'm Hari-kirtana Das. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you, an honor to have you here with me. And those of you who are here with me real time, if you would be kind enough to confirm that you can in fact hear the words coming out of my mouth or raising your hands, thank you very much for your cooperation. I'll try not to be late. I am blessed and cursed at the same time. I think this is true for many of us. We take birth according to our karma, and therefore we are awarded parents whose DNA, whose psychology, whose circumstances are conducive for taking birth according to our karma. And one of the things that I seem to have inherited is my father's inclination to leave exactly the right amount of time to get from point A to point B, provided that there's no problems, there's no margin for error. This is something I've actually been working on for quite some time. There were many ways in which I vowed I would not live my father's life. But some things are inescapable. I sneeze the same way he sneezes, I yawn the same way he yawns. And my sense of time is also a little like his. Being a yoga teacher has actually been very helpful for me in this respect, because as a yoga teacher, I always have to get where I'm going so that I arrive 15 minutes before the class is actually supposed to start. And that's kind of spilled over into other facets of my life. And so in this case, it's similar. Even though I show up, after a minute after 8, just to give all of you a little bit of extra time to show up, I'm actually sitting here for a good 15 minutes before I hit the broadcast button. Anyway, a little aside about karma and how it manifests for me. Perhaps you also have a tendency that you have inherited that most people would say, well, you got that from your parents or something like that. When we understand Bhagavad-gita, we understand that, yes, that's true, but it's incomplete. We have been given a situation that's conducive for playing out our karma. So it's not just that we got it from our parents, it's that we got the parents that we got in order for them to imbue us with our karmic destiny, so to speak. Anyway, if you can think of something in yourself that you would like to share in the chat that isn't too personal, then please feel free to do so. Or, share something about your siblings. They're not here in Bhagavad-gita Satsang. They're never going to know. Anyway, speaking of siblings, Haribol sis. All right, let's take care of our housekeeping, as is our usual habit. So, if you're new to the satsang, adjust your audio settings and viewing options if you so desire. Up in the upper right-hand corner, I think, is where you are going to find your controls. No need to worry about your microphone or video camera, because I cannot see or hear you. Presumably you can see and or hear me. If you would like to make yourself heard, type something in the chat. If you've got a question, you can put it in the Q&A box as well. Either way, I will keep an eye out for it and look for your comments and questions. And with that, oh, good, we've got a question already. So are these inherited traits counted as samskaras or completely genetic? I think that genetics are physical manifestations of samskaras, which are metaphysical. So you may recall that our understanding is the process of creation proceeds in the same way that the manufacturing of a light bulb proceeds. The physical product is the end of the process. Prior to that, you have a design, you've got the raw materials. Then you've got the design. Then before that, you've got the idea, and before that, you've got an understanding of the laws of nature and electricity. So you have a samskara, and you're going to ride your subtle body, mind, intelligence, and ego, carrying that samskara into the womb of your mother, and the raw materials to make the light bulb of your material body are there. And you are now ready, your body is ready to be assembled, and you will get a body that is an external representation of your physical body, that's an external representation of your subtle body. So the samskara is there, and the genetics are the raw materials, and then your body and psychology, that's like the finished product, that's the light bulb. So that's my understanding. And I hope that makes sense. And if anyone has another way to look at that from the teachings of the Bhagavad-gita, I would want to hear about it. But Kamlarada, let me know if that is a satisfactory answer. Okay, where were we? We were at sharing, because I'm just such a generous guy. I'm going to share. Well, I'm going to share my screen with you. Last week, chapter 13, the yoga of reflection on spirit and matter. We concluded Krishna's definition of knowledge, or that is to say, the states of being that are conducive for or indicate the presence of knowledge, the process of knowledge. We looked at a description of Brahman, the spiritual ground of being, and we started to hear the paradoxical language of the Upanishads, which we will continue to do this evening. We looked at, by my count, verses 10 through 14, but in your edition of the Bhagavad-gita, if it counted the first verse as a verse, then that would have been 11 through 15. Some editions, for those of you who are wondering what the heck I'm talking about, some editions of the Bhagavad-gita do not actually count Arjuna's question at the very beginning of this chapter as a verse. There is some sense that it was added later and therefore doesn't count, whereas other editions of the Gita, they count it. So, for example, in Graham Schwagg's edition of Bhagavad Gita, the Beloved Lord's Secret Love Song, the verse of Arjuna's question is there, but it's unnumbered, and then he proceeds to number from there. Whereas in some editions, you don't see the question at all, and in other editions, it counts as the first verse. So I wasn't really sure what to do, so I chose the most complicated thing, which is also just a karmic predisposition that I appear to have, much to everyone's chagrin and dismay. Tonight's class, we will proceed to speak about the Paramatma, and one of my favorite phrases from contemporary yoga land, the light in you bows to the light in, no, the light in me bows to the light in you. Well, the light in me is the light in you, and we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. Material nature as the cause of effects, the soul as a different cause to different effects, and the soul and material nature and what that relationship is. So we will be covering verses 15 through 21 by my count, 16 to 22 by your count, if you counted, your edition counted the first verse. And before we do anything else, we will chant our invocation mantra. So, quick note about the diacritical marks that give you a cue for the pronunciation in transliterated Sanskrit. The dot over the M indicates that we close our lips together, but at the same time, we also close the back of our tongue to the back of the roof of our mouth. A bar across a vowel indicates an open and slightly elongated version of the vowel as opposed to a short version when there is no bar. And with that, I will chant. If you like, you can chant back. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Translation: I offer my respects to the Supreme Person, the Son of Vasudeva, who is the all-pervading transcendent. All right. Last week, we left off with, by my count, verse 14. The original source of all senses, yet devoid of all senses, unattached and yet the maintainer of all, free of qualities, born of material nature, and at the same time the master of all the qualities of material nature. So this was a cliffhanger because there's a continuation of this description that will show up in the next verse. Meanwhile, a few interesting things about this verse. In the Sanskrit, one of the words that Krishna uses here is guna, meaning qualities, or in the context of this verse, it means of the qualities. And it doesn't just refer to qualities in general, but there's a qualification. What kind of qualities? You have to qualify your qualities. And when we talk about gunas, we are talking about the three qualities of material nature. So later in this verse, we hear the phrase nirgunam, without qualities, which means without material qualities. So in this verse, nirguna means no material qualities, as opposed to just no qualities of any kind whatsoever. We are making a distinction between material qualities and spiritual qualities, as opposed to assuming that qualities by definition are material and the opposite of qualities is no qualities, and therefore emptiness or the absence of any discernible quality or no attributes is the technical term that is used by Vedantists when discussing this sort of thing. So let's hang with this for just a moment more before we move on to the verses for this evening. So here Krishna is saying that, now he's speaking about himself in the third person, which is kind of an interesting thing to do, but he's doing that because he's speaking about his expansion. Krishna himself doesn't get personally involved in our lives while we're engaged with material nature for the sake of exploiting material nature in the interest of satisfying our own desires. He just kind of lets us do our thing, doesn't interfere with our free will, doesn't get directly involved. But he also wants to stay in touch with us as we meander around the material world. And so, by virtue of his expansion as Paramatma, or the supreme soul within the heart of all souls, he hangs with us and goes wherever we go, waiting for us to realize he's there and that we have a relationship with him that we can reactivate at any time. So here's the thing about us. We have spiritual senses, and those spiritual senses are covered over by material senses. So once again, we're making a distinction between not just senses and no senses, but between material senses and spiritual senses. And because our spiritual senses are covered by matter, we are not capable of seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting anything than matter. Our senses are therefore constrained by this covering to the realm of matter. Well, the Paramatma's senses are not so constrained. So even though our material senses are ultimately caused by the supreme person in the form of this expansion, that expansion, just like the original from whom the expansion comes, is never covered over by matter, and therefore never subject to illusion either. So here is where some of these paradoxical descriptions of the absolute truth in the Upanishads come back. We hear in the Shvetasvatara Upanishad verses that say that the supreme person has no hands, but yet he accepts whatever is offered to him. Well, he has no material hands, not hands like ours, but this does not mean that the supreme person is without a form. Otherwise, how could such an offering be accepted? Now, of course, Krishna, this is a kind of far out thing about Krishna's senses, is that they're totally interchangeable. There's also a description of how the supreme person can eat with his eyes and see with his nose, and et cetera, et cetera. So whereas one of our limitations is that one sense can only do one thing, and the supreme person is not so limited, and all of his senses can do all of the things. And similarly, we can experience spiritual life through spiritual senses once this covering of material senses is lifted. And that's what Krishna is encouraging us to do, engage in the project of getting out from under the covering of this material nature. And with that, by the way, if you have any questions about any of that quick review from last week, please go ahead and pop it in the chat or the Q&A box. Meanwhile, I will proceed with our translation and commentary of verses 15 through 21 or 16 through 22, depending on the edition you have, and therefore feel free to follow the bouncing ball. So I will read through the translations for each verse, then go back and look at each verse in detail. Here we go. This is, by my count, verse 15 translation. By the way, usually I use my own translations. This evening I'm using a few of my own translations and other translations by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada from his edition of Bhagavad-gita as it is. The supreme truth exists outside and inside of all living beings, in both the moving and the non-moving, being subtle and beyond the power of the material senses to see or to know, the supreme truth is both far away and yet near to all. Text 16. Although the supersoul appears to be divided among all beings, he is never divided. He is situated as one. Although he is the maintainer of every living entity, it is to be understood that he devours and develops all. Text 17. He is the source of light in all luminous objects. He is beyond the darkness of matter and is unmanifested. He is knowledge. He is the object of knowledge. He is the goal of knowledge. He is situated in everyone's heart. Text 18. I have summarily described the field of activities, the body, knowledge, and the knower. Only those who are devoted to me can realize this, and thus attain to my nature. Text 19. Material nature and the living entities should be understood to be beginningless. The transformations and the modes of matter are products of material nature. Nature is said, text 20, nature is said to be the cause of all material causes and effects, whereas the living entity is the cause of the various sufferings and enjoyments of this world. 21. A person thus situated in material nature experiences a mode of being born of that nature, clinging to an identity that arises from the qualities of material nature one meets with good and evil in the course of taking birth among various species. Right? And now we'll go back and take it from the top. So our first verse, once again, this is text 15 or 16. The supreme truth exists outside and inside of all living beings, in both the moving and the non-moving, being subtle and beyond the power of the material senses to see or to know. The supreme truth is both far away and yet near to all. So this paradoxical language now, both far away and near to all, is not measured in distance the way we would measure inches, yards, miles, light years, etc. The Paramatma is closer to us than anyone could possibly be. The Paramatma is the soul of all souls, the person who is within our own spiritual heart. You just don't get any closer than that. And yet, because the material covering puts so much, let's call it existential distance between us, far away. And farther still is Krishna himself, the original personal form of Bhagavan, who is never in the material world. Even when he shows up in the material world, he's never affected by the material world. And yet here he is on the battlefield speaking to Arjuna in his original spiritual form. As we've discussed earlier, even though Krishna shows up in his original spiritual form, not everybody picks up on the fact of who he is, because he doesn't reveal himself to everybody. A devotee, that is to say, someone who, in accordance with all of the instructions that we have heard previously from Krishna, is engaged in the process of bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotional service. Someone who is has made Krishna the center of their lives and is engaged in activities that are all, therefore, centered around Krishna. That's a person who can see him. And throughout the earlier chapters, Krishna has confirmed this. He's confirmed that Arjuna's qualification from hearing from him is because he is a devotee of Krishna's as well as his friend. There are verses in the 11th chapter, just a couple of chapters ago, where Krishna confirms that this is the only way that you can see this. The Brahma Samhita characterizes this as eyes anointed with the salve of love. He makes himself visible for those who are who love him, and he becomes more and more visible to those who are cultivating that kind of a relationship with him, and that's natural. If you go out on a date, you start seeing somebody socially, little by little you reveal yourself, just to, see how they respond to you. And unless you're speed dating maybe, and then you just reveal everything all at once. I don't know, I've never done this. And it's culturally far enough away that I actually can't wrap my head around it. But be that as it may, the principle usually is you get to know somebody and then you gradually reveal yourself to them as they reveal themselves to you. So it's the same process. Bhakti yoga is a gradual awakening of spiritual senses, a gradual dissolution of the matter that covers our spiritual senses so that we can start to see with spiritual vision. And as that process unfolds, who are we going to see? Well, we will see the Supreme Person, the Absolute Truth, the Paramatma, who is closer to us than anyone else. And as the relationship develops further, the personal form of the Supreme Person. But I digress, because right now we're talking about Paramatma. And in this next verse, Krishna will speak about how to understand the soul within all souls. So once again, this is verse 16 or 17. Although the supersoul appears to be divided among all beings, he is never divided. He is situated as one. Although he is the maintainer of every living entity, it is to be understood that he devours and develops all. So this brings us to one of my favorite pet peeves of modern yoga, the or let's say, interpretive translation of the word namaste, as the light in me bows to the light in me. For me, this is straight from the taste great, less filling school of candy-coated platitudes. Because if you think about it, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But when you want to say something that just sounds nice, feels good, you don't want to ruin it by thinking about it too much. But if you're like me and you just have to ruin everything for everybody all the time, look, if there's a light in me, I don't know what it's doing. It doesn't do what I tell it to do. And I'm not saying I'm telling the light in me to bow to the light in you. This is conjecture. So we don't know what the light in us is doing, whether it's bowing or not. The implication, of course, is that the light in me is the same as the light in you, which is correct, but it's not very likely that the same light that's in me is going to bow to the same light that's in you, because why would the light do that? First of all, you need a prism to bend the light. So there's that. But it's like, why would that happen? So for one thing, the actual word that you want to use in that circumstance is namaskar. So kara, same root as karma, doing. Namas means to make the shape of a bow, round. So to bow, the act of bowing. So namaskar, I am engaged in the act of bowing, like Surya Namaskar, up to the sun, and then I bow down. And that's why it's called Surya Namaskar, because you're making an action that is showing your reverence for the sun. In my classes, after years of saying namaste because I couldn't really think what else to say, and that's what everybody said, and I was just kind of like going with the flow on that, I just started saying, I offer my respects to all of you, after some other stuff that I say that is the signifier that class dismissed. I mean, we're out of here. Here's the thing to understand as far as this goes. I'm not you and you're not me. But the Paramatma in my heart is the same person that's in your heart. Yet, showing up in these different places, in your heart, in my heart, and in the hearts of everybody else on the land, sea, and air. So here's a good way to think about this. If it's noon in Lawrence, Kansas, and for those of you who don't know, Lawrence, Kansas is situated about as in the middle of the continental United States as you can get. If it's noon then in Lawrence, and it's a nice sunny day all across the country, then the sun will be on the head of a person in Lawrence, and also a person in New York, and a person in San Francisco, and a person in San Antonio, and a person up in Butte, Montana. In other words, everywhere. So the sun is in one place. There's one sun, it's in one place, but it's shining in all these different places, and you can see it from all these different places. So this is how you can think about the Paramatma as one indivisible person situated in every place at the same time. Anyway. If you have any questions about that analogy or how to understand the super soul, please go ahead and pop them in the chat or the Q&A box. The other interesting thing in this verse is how he's the maintainer of every living entity, but he's also the person in charge of destruction and creation. So usually we hear about creation, maintenance, and destruction being carried out by the three different devas or gods. Brahma in charge of creation, Vishnu in charge of maintenance, Shiva in charge of destruction. Here, Krishna is taking a step back and letting us know that ultimately he, in his form of the expansion, technically known as Kshirodakshaya Vishnu, is actually where all three of these things are coming from. Vishnu will directly take care of maintenance because he's the only one qualified to do it. But the power to create that Brahma has ultimately comes from Kshirodakshaya Vishnu, or the Paramatma. And the destructive power that Lord Shiva has, that's also ultimately coming from the same place. So as time, we have already seen in the 11th chapter how Krishna devours everyone in the form of time. And yet, he is the ultimate source of the material energy, this divine energy of his, through which all of our bodies arise, through which everything we experience in the material world comes about. That's also his energy. So the what are called the material cause and the efficient cause all eventually roll back to Kshirodakshaya Vishnu. He is the source of material nature, and that's how the material world manifests through the agency of this expansion, and his various responsibilities are delegated out from him. And so the material cause comes into being from him, and yet he is also the efficient cause. We're going to come back to this efficient cause and material cause in just a moment. Meanwhile, we're going to move on to the next verse, verse 17 or 18. He is the source of light of all luminous objects. He is beyond the darkness of matter and is unmanifested. So let's hang with that word for a moment, unmanifested. This is often taken to mean that the absolute truth has no name, form, qualities, activities, relationships, energies, potencies. There's nothing. And we find this often in other intellectualized theologies. The idea that beyond the form is something formless. The assumption is that anything that has a form is material, and therefore any manifestation of the absolute truth in a form is a material form that somehow or other is connecting us to something formless. The other way to understand unmanifested, which I think is a simpler and more direct way, is to say that not material. Unmanifested means we can't see this person because, once again, our senses are covered by matter, therefore we can only perceive matter, and the Supreme Person is not made of matter. Therefore, we can't see it. He is knowledge, he is the object of knowledge, and he is the goal of knowledge. And he is situated in everyone's hearts. So, he is the source of light in all luminous objects, which means everything from the sun to the bioluminescent jellyfish deep, 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 deep in the ocean where the sunlight will not go. The source of illumination in all objects. So matter is not naturally luminous. A living being has to be there. That's is to say something conscious has to make light happen. The nuclear reaction inside the core of the sun, or the interesting chemistry that makes bioluminescence happen in deep sea fish. That's all how it's done on the level of how the material elements are combining. But then there's the question of, well, what is the source of the material elements? And that rolls back to just what we were speaking about before. The spiritual realm that we cannot see due to the covering of matter does not need to have anyone turn a lamp on. It is luminous by its very nature. The spiritual realm that we currently don't have access to is in no need of a sun or light fixtures or anything like that, because all of us are naturally spiritually bioluminescent. That is to say, spiritual form glows. Practically speaking, you could say made of pure spiritual light. The Shvetasvatara Upanishad has a description of the Supreme Person as being eternally luminous, beyond the darkness of this material world, like just like the sun, except it is the glow coming off, the natural glow of the form of the Supreme Person. So that's just kind of how the Supreme Person is. And we have the same kind of qualities. Therefore, in our own spiritual nature, we are also luminescent. Which brings us to text 18 or 19. Krishna is going to sum things up here for us. I have summarily described the field of activities, the body, knowledge, and the knowable. Only my devotees can realize this and thus attain to my nature. So, attain to my nature means realize that as infinitesimal parts of the infinite complete whole, we have the same qualities as the complete whole, just not the quantity of being the complete whole. And yet, when we hear verses like this, many times they will be interpreted as meaning you attain the nature of God, which means you become God. You, if you have all the same qualities of God, then you must be God. This is not what Krishna is saying. If he were saying this, he'd be contradicting himself, because he's made a really clear distinction between himself and us over and over again. So it's not logical by any direct reading of the text that that's what this means. You really have to read stuff into the text that isn't really there in order to come to the conclusion that Krishna is saying that you will become me when you attain my nature. No, we attain the qualities. Just like a saintly person has the qualities, or has God-like qualities. So it's more like that, except taken to its ultimate fulfillment. Krishna says that only my devotees can realize this, can fully understand this, can really wrap their heads around it. So again, back in the fourth chapter, Krishna tells Arjuna that he is representing the science of yoga as he had previously presented it And the reason he's presenting it specifically to Arjuna is because he can understand the transcendental mystery of this science. And the reason he can understand the mystery of this science is because, in addition to being Krishna's friend, he is Krishna's devotee. Krishna specifically uses the phrase "Bhakto si me," indicating because you are my devotee. And then Sakha Cheti as well as my friend. So Krishna has described three things in this cluster of verses. The field of activity, otherwise known as the body and its transformations in relationship to the world. Knowledge, specifically conditions or states of being that are conducive to knowledge or indicative of knowledge. The way you need to be in order for knowledge to happen is another way of thinking about what Krishna has described in this section of the Gita. And then the third thing is that which is knowable, which has two parts. The Jivatma, that is to say, we can understand who we are, and the Paramatma. So we can understand who is the knower of each individual body and who is the knower of all bodies. And that's encouraging to know that that's knowable. So now that I've said that, I'll remember that I meant to share my screen with you and show it to you. Why should you just take my word for it when you can look at a slide? So, summary of verses from 5 through 17 or 6 through 18 in chapter 13. The field, the body and its transformations, knowledge, conditions conducive to, indicative of knowledge, the knowable, the knowers of the field, and we have two categories. The Jivatma, of which there are many, and they are the knowers of their individual field of activities, and the Paramatma, who is the knower in all fields of activity. All right. Let me know if you have any questions about this portion, this little summary of what Krishna has spoken about. And while I anxiously await your questions or comments, we'll go on to the next two verses, 19 and 20, I'll put together. Material nature and the living entities should be understood to be beginningless. Their transformations and modes of matter are products of material nature. All right, I won't put them together, I'll take them apart. So material nature and the living entities. There's no way to trace out the beginning of material nature, because even though things come and go and creation happens and then annihilation happens and then it starts again, the energy of which the material world is composed, which Krishna is calling here material nature, is his energy, and therefore it's eternal, because Krishna's energy is concurrent with him, and he's eternal. So just as Krishna has always been, material nature has also always been, and because we are parts of Krishna in a different category of energy from material nature, spiritual, but marginal spiritual rather than material, we are also beginningless. We also have no beginning, and nor can we trace back when, where, and how we came to be covered by material nature. It's simply not possible. Their transformations and the modes of matter are products of material nature. That is to say, we actually don't change. The consciousness that is the symptom of the presence of the person is always aware of all these changes, a whole lot of changing going on. But the person who is conscious remains unchanged in the ultimate issue. We usually say, well, things happen and they change us. Well, it changes our psychology, it changes our emotions, it changes how we feel about things, how we look at the world, and all of that, as far as Krishna is concerned, is in the category of matter. Subtle matter in so far as the metaphysical components of mind, intelligence, and ego are concerned, and they develop according to our experiences in this way or that way. And so we say, I become a different person. I grew up. Something happened and changed my life, changed my perspective. All right, that's fine. That's valid. The person who experienced the change is unchanged. That is to say, there's one step back beyond all of the transformations of the modes of material nature that we identify with as our personality. So that's what Krishna is referring to here. Then, in the next verse, nature is said to be the cause of all material causes and effects, whereas the living entity is the cause of the various sufferings and enjoyments in this world. So material nature is a real thing. It's illusory insofar as it's temporary, comes into being, stays for a minute, goes out of being, now you see it, now you don't. So in that respect, it's understood to be illusory because it's temporary. However, that doesn't invalidate our experience of being in the world, and the energy itself is divine energy. It's totally real. So the material energy is a real thing, and the living entity, the individual person, you and I, we are also real things. We are tattvas. We are components of reality. And therefore, we have existed before this creation, and when this creation, when this material universe is annihilated, we will still be. Because the Supreme Person will still be, and we're part of the Supreme Person. That's just how it works. You may be disappointed that you can't just check out. Sorry. But we are part of reality, and reality keeps on going, like the Energizer Bunny. We are responsible for what happens to us. That is to say, material nature responds to us. It's doing everything. We're not actually making it happen, in the sense that we're not controlling it. But material nature is responding to us ultimately under Krishna's direction in order to fulfill our desires. Whatever we want, you can get it here. The material world is like Alice's restaurant. You can get anything you want. But you also have to accept the reaction for getting it. Which is to say, whatever you order, you have to pay the check. So there's desire that puts things in motion. Material nature responds to us in the form of a nice meal at the counter, and then karma shows up and says, here's the check. Now you got to pay the check. You enjoyed, now you have to pay. It's actually totally fair. Remember to tip your wait people. The Supreme Person, by the way, residing in your heart, does not partake of the meal, nor does he pay the check. He's completely aloof from the whole thing. And not only that, we think that we're paying the check, but that's just yet another thing that is happening to us that is actually completely external from our original spiritual identity that is kind of sleeping through the whole thing. Which brings us to our last verse for the evening, and I will share my screen with you so that we can chant this verse. There we go. Come back. There we go. All right. So we're heading into the home stretch here. The dots under letters perform similarly to dots over, same ballpark. A dot under an R is a little different because you're going to draw the tip of your tongue back towards maybe 2/3 of the way toward the roof of your mouth rather than put it right behind your teeth. So it'll end up being a little bit of a trill sound as you bring your tongue back forward for the next sound. So it's brr. And you got a few of those here. An apostrophe in front of a consonant means a vowel was dropped out for euphonic combination purposes, and the vowel that ends the word prior to the apostrophe will now run right into the rest of the word that remains after the apostrophe. And that's it. We don't really have much in the way of fancy diacritical marks in this verse. So I will chant each line. You chant each line back if you wish. Purusha prakriti sthohi bhunte prakriti jan gunam Kanganam guna sangosya sad asad yoni janmasu. The dots under the ends can be a little tricky. I pronounced gunam. Anyway, practice and all is coming. Translation. A person thus situated in material nature experiences a mode of being born of that nature. Clinging to an identity that arises from the qualities of material nature, one meets with good and evil in the course of taking birth among various species. So, here's a news flash for us, which is that there is no real guarantee that we'll always take a human birth. This is really, really hard for us to wrap our heads around, and harder still to accept the idea that we could end up being a bird or a fish or a elephant or something like that. But this is what we're being told. According to our various desires and reactions to our actions, material nature will place us in different bodies, different kinds of bodies. And we get a combination of what we desire and what we deserve. And once we get that body, then we come under the control of material nature. So our free will is very, very constrained. We think we've got a lot of it, but it's actually a pretty minuscule amount. Once you're in a particular body, then you have to behave a particular way. For example, I have to yawn like my father. I have to sneeze like my father. It's nice because I get to remember him every time I yawn or sneeze. I have to be right on time, just like my father. And if I were put into the body of a dog, I would have to bark if I was going to make any sound, because that's just how dogs are. It's not like I could choose between, speaking like a human or meowing like a cat or chirping like a cardinal or something like that. No, I have to behave like a dog. So the living entity has no power to change the laws of material nature that they come under the influence of once a material body has been entered into. You have to play out the string of that particular karma and then move on. The constant, of course, is the Supreme Person. If I'm in the body of a dog, or the body of a cardinal, or the body of an elephant, or the body of a dolphin, or a bioluminescent jellyfish, whatever, the Paramatma will still be there. All right. Last call for questions. We're just about out of time. Well, no, actually, we are already out of time. So I beg your indulgence while I try to wrap things up as quickly as I can. Tonight's class, we have spoken about how the light in me is the light in you, and you can judge for yourself whether the light is bound to anyone or not. We spoke about material nature as the cause of effects, the soul as the cause of the effects of how material nature responds to us, the relationship of the soul and material nature, and how we can't really change the rules once we have entered into a particular situation in material nature. If you have any questions after the fact, please write to me, Hari at Hari-kirtana.com. I'm always very, very happy to receive your correspondence and hear what you think about it. Having to do with the Bhagavad-gita and this class. Just so you know, there's some limits. You can write to me, tell me whatever you like. There's no. Next week, we will move a little further into chapter 13. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Paramatma. There'll be a whole lot of selfing going on. So we're going to talk about the self. We're going to talk about the process of knowledge and the relationship of spiritual vision to ethics, and how the development of our spiritual vision informs ethics and moral decision making. So that will be verses 22 through 28 by my count, and perhaps 23 through 29 by yours. And that's all, folks. Here we go. What is the point of the Paramatma being in an animal body if it can't form a realization of that relationship with God? Well, you could ask the same thing about, I don't know, 95% of all people. I mean, human beings generally have the potential to realize this relationship. Simply by virtue of being in a human body, the potential is there to ask the question, hey, who am I? How did I get here? How does this work? How did I get here? How do I work this thing, etc.? The Supreme Person just loves us so much that he wants to hang out with us all the time, no matter where we go. And the understanding from yoga scripture is that the Paramatma is directing the wanderings of all living beings. So how does a deer know which grass to eat and which grass not to eat? That's Paramatma within the heart. We call it instinct. But the direction of, how to swim at super speed that the dolphin has, that's coming from Paramatma. How to fly. A bird has a very small brain. It's not thinking about, how are the aerodynamics going to work when I flap my wings? It just knows how to do this. And that knowledge is coming from Paramatma. So directing the wanderings of all living beings, and from the Paramatma within the heart comes remembrance, knowledge, and forgetfulness. Therefore, the point of the Paramatma being there is to provide us, to facilitate, to give us everything we need in order to fulfill our desires. And so he's there to facilitate our experience. And eventually anyone in an animal body will float up to a human body and get another shot to realize that, all this time my best friend has been giving me guidance and providing for all of my desires. I should strike up a conversation with this person. So I hope that is a Satisfactory answer. Okay, you are satisfied. I am satisfied. Tulsi Priya, oh, thank you very much. The intelligence of the living entity is the form, direction of the supersoul. Yes. Yeah, that's where that comes from. If you know how to screw in a light bulb, it's only because the Paramatma gave you that knowledge, that information. All right, we have run over by a little bit, so thank you for sticking with me. Those of you who are all here in real time, I deeply appreciate your being here, and it is always a great pleasure for me to spend this time with you. Thank you very, very much, all of you who have just spent your time with me listening to the recording. I hope to see all of you again very, very soon. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. All right. Good night.